So every time there was a new technology introduced during this moment in American history, it had spiritual repercussions.
Peter Manso is a scholar of American religious history and author of several books, including one about how photography's rise in the mid-1800s coincided with a new religious movement gaining ground in the US and Europe: spiritualism. The principal belief of spiritualism was that contact with the dead was possible if you had the right means. That connection was made through a medium, a person who claimed they could communicate with the dead. From the beginning, many people suspected spiritualist mediums to be frauds. Still, the movement grew to include thousands, and by some accounts, millions of Americans in the late 19th century, including high-profile people like Mary Todd Lincoln, who turned to spiritualism to help process the death of her son Willie in 1862. During this period in American history, the need to reach the dead became more critical than ever.
With the coming of the Civil War and with casualties on an order that Americans had never experienced before, this hunger to communicate with the spirit world really took off.
So when an unknown amateur photographer in Boston began developing photos that apparently included apparitions of the dead, it attracted the attention of the spiritualists. William Mumler, an engraver by trade, had been tinkering with photography in a studio owned by his eventual wife, Hannah, a spiritualist medium and professional photographer.
It seems to be the case that Hannah Stewart taught William Mumler photography.
According to Hannah, William accidentally captured the spirit of his dead cousin while taking a practice self-portrait, at a time he said he was alone in the studio in 1862.
And he soon was mobbed with spiritualists in Boston who were eager to see if he could do this again.
And as it turns out, he could, always with Hannah nearby.
She was the experienced photographer here. Mumler became the public face, but she knew what she was doing.
The Mumlers took photo after photo that miraculously revealed that a spirit of a lost loved one, or sometimes a total stranger, was in the room with the sitter. Even though the Mumlers' spirit forms were usually faint and out of focus, people coming in for portraits often reported that they recognized the spirits in the photos as the very family members they were hoping to connect with. Spirit photography seemed to be the next level of connection to the afterlife.
You no longer needed to be there in the presence of the medium. You could take these photographs with you anywhere and say, see, this is real.
And like all things spiritualists did, spirit photography brought its fair share of skeptics and people trying to figure out the trick.
You have a lot of people from the photographic community in Boston who were seeking out his services, specifically to show that he was not who he said he was. A variety of them went and tried to follow him through the full photographic process, and no one could ever figure out exactly what he was doing and how he was doing it.
But enough accusations of fakery in Boston eventually prompted the Mumlers to shut the studio down and relocate.
Mumler arrives in New York several years after he became notorious in Boston. Maybe enough time had elapsed that his name would no longer mean anything.
New York City at this time was where all the top American photographers and galleries were, and starting in 1869, where a spirit photographer from Boston had opened up shop.
And he was really only operating there for a matter of months before he ran afoul with the law.
Mumler was arrested on fraud charges and thrown in jail. His trial was written up in New York newspapers and appeared on the front page of Harper's Weekly, which called it remarkable and without precedent.
He was just beloved by the media because he was such a colorful character and making such outrageous claims that just made great copy.
The trial was kind of a circus. The prosecution brought in P.T. Barnum of Barnum and Bailey's Greatest Show on Earth fame as a key witness and self-described expert of humbug.
P.T. Barnum always had a problem with spiritualists because he felt that they were taking advantage of grief, and he felt that it was going too far. So he made it very clear that he was happy to see Mumler caught and to see him go down.
But there was one small problem for the prosecution.
None of those experts, all of whom followed Mumler through his process, none of them could say, this is exactly what Mumler did and I saw him do it.
The prosecution listed 9 different ways Mumler might have done his trick, some of them pretty elaborate, like placing a microscopic picture of the spirit inside the camera through a screw hole, or a secret light that impressed the ghost onto the glass plate when it's coated with photosensitive chemicals inside this tank. They argued that his photos must be explainable by at least one of the methods, and that Hannah Mumler was somehow involved. possibly as a distraction. One of the simplest ways to get a spirit photo then and now is a technique called Sir David Brewster's ghost, where the spirit is only in frame for a few seconds, while the main sitter holds still for the rest of the exposure, in our case, nearly a full minute.
50, all right. Okay, you can relax.
Leaving a faint, ghostly form behind the sitter.
And we did that. We did the easy way first, just to show how that could be done.
But this can't be how Mumler did it in front of skeptical photographers watching his every move.
If you're going to try to show this as real spirit photography in front of witnesses, you can't have somebody dress up as a ghost and walk in.
Even though the prosecution demonstrated that spirit photos can be made through trick photography, they couldn't confidently identify Mumler's method, and therefore failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that his pictures were not of spiritual origin. And Mumler was acquitted. So, how did he do it? Mark thinks he has an answer, and agreed to try his theory out with Bridget and me. First, Mark took a regular portrait with no ghost, the kind Mumler would have been observed doing. Then, he carefully outlined my position on the ground glass of the camera. Bridget dressed in a white suit, and we covered her face and hands with white powder, and Mark created a separate negative of the ghost. Lining it up so the hands landed